It was late autumn when the leaves of the old oak trees and maplewood began to turn golden. The small town was peaceful, almost too quiet at times, but for 19-year-old Ethan Walker, it had never truly felt like home. His life had been marked by absence. His mother had passed when he was a boy, and his father, drifting from one job to another, had rarely been around. Ethan had grown used to carrying the weight of loneliness on his shoulders, though he rarely showed it. He was kind, hardworking, the type of young man who never turned down a chance to help a neighbor, but deep inside, he longed for something that felt like belonging. On a chilly afternoon, Ethan was riding his worn-out bicycle through the quieter side of town, past streets where most houses stood with closed curtains and gardens that had long been forgotten. That was when he saw her, an older woman struggling to carry two heavy grocery bags up the steps of a faded white house. She looked fragile, her silver hair neatly tied back, her face marked with years of sorrow and silence. Ethan didn't know who she was, but something in her eyes stopped him. Without thinking, he parked his bicycle and jogged over. "Let me help you with that," he said softly, taking the bags before she could protest. She looked startled at first, then a little defensive. "I don't usually take help from strangers." "Then let me introduce myself," Ethan replied with a smile. "Ethan Walker, just a kid who hates watching someone struggle." The woman studied him for a long moment before her expression softened. "Margaret," she said quietly. "Margaret Holloway." From that day on, an unusual connection began. Ethan started stopping by her house after school or after working shifts at the local gas station. At first, it was small things, mowing her lawn, carrying groceries, fixing a broken light bulb, but slowly, something deeper unfolded. Margaret Holloway was 67 years old, a widow who had lived alone for nearly 15 years. Her husband, a decorated war veteran, had passed suddenly of a heart attack. Since then, her life had been filled with silence, her house a museum of memories. People in town whispered about her. Some called her the lonely widow, others said she was strange, but no one truly knew her. Ethan listened to her stories in a way no one else did. He learned that Margaret loved painting, though her brushes had been dry for decades. He learned she adored classical music, but never played it anymore, because it reminded her too much of her late husband. And he learned that deep down, despite her age and her grief, she still longed to feel useful, to matter. Ethan gave her that chance. He would sit at her kitchen table, books spread open, asking her to help him with essays, or sometimes just talking about life. She, in turn, found herself making him dinner, baking bread like she once had for her family, even laughing at his corny jokes. To the outside world, it was strange, a teenage boy and a 67-year-old widow spending afternoons together. But to them, it was something pure, a companionship born not of convenience, but of kindness. Of course, whispers began. At the diner where Ethan sometimes worked nights, people started murmuring. "What's that boy doing with her? Doesn't he have friends his age? That widow's just lonely and desperate." Ethan heard it, but he didn't care. Margaret heard it too, and sometimes it cut her deeper than she admitted. But every time she looked at Ethan's bright, earnest face, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: hope. One evening, as rain drummed softly on the windows, Margaret asked, "Ethan, why do you come here so often? You're young. You should be out with friends, not wasting your time with an old woman like me." Ethan looked at her, his eyes steady. "Because you're not a waste of time. You're someone who makes me feel less alone. And maybe I make you feel the same." Tears filled Margaret's eyes, and for the first time in years, she reached across the table, placing her hand over his. It wasn't romantic. It was human. It was two souls, separated by decades of age, but united by the same aching need for connection. As weeks turned into months, their bond deepened. Ethan fixed up Margaret's neglected garden, planting tulips and roses that burst into color by spring. Margaret, in return, painted again, this time capturing Ethan's youthful energy on canvas, his laughter immortalized in brushstrokes. Together, they rebuilt pieces of themselves that the world had forgotten. But not everyone saw it as beautiful. Ethan's father, when he returned briefly to town, exploded with anger. "What the hell are you doing spending all your time with some old widow? People are talking, Ethan. Do you want to be the laughingstock of this town?" Ethan stood his ground. "I don't care what they say. She's the only person who's ever really seen me." "Margaret," hearing this, almost told him to leave, to spare him the weight of gossip and judgment. But Ethan refused. "I choose this, Margaret. I choose kindness. I choose you." The turning point came one winter morning when Margaret fell ill. Ethan found her collapsed in the kitchen, and panic surged through him. He called for help, stayed by her side at the hospital, holding her hand as if his presence alone could keep her alive. For 3 days, he barely left her bedside. Nurses whispered about the boy who wouldn't leave the widow's side. Doctors shook their heads at his devotion. When Margaret finally opened her eyes, weak but smiling, the first words she whispered were, "I thought I'd lost you." "You'll never lose me," Ethan replied, tears streaming down his face. Word spread across town. The whispers changed. No longer were people mocking them. Now they were moved. The boy who stayed. The widow who smiled again. Slowly, people began to understand that what they shared was not scandal, but love of the purest kind. Not romantic, not conventional, but something far rarer. A bond forged through selflessness and humanity. By spring, Margaret's health had improved, though she walked slower and tired easily. Ethan continued to be her constant companion. One day, at the town's community center, Margaret unveiled her paintings for the first time in decades. She displayed portraits of Ethan, of flowers in bloom, of moments that captured life's fragile beauty. The townspeople stood in awe. "I wouldn't have painted again," Margaret told them softly, "if not for the kindness of one young man who reminded me that life is still worth living." The applause that filled the room wasn't just for her art. It was for them, for the bond that had defied judgment and taught an entire town what true humanity looked like. Years later, when Ethan was older and Margaret's hair had turned completely white, their story was still told in Maplewood. Not as a scandal, not as a curiosity, but as a testament. A young man who gave his time, his heart, and his unwavering kindness to a woman the world had overlooked. A widow who gave back to him a sense of belonging, a home in the truest sense of the word. And when Margaret eventually passed, peacefully in her sleep, Ethan was there, holding her hand just as he had in the hospital years before. He wept, but he didn't feel alone, not truly. Because the love they shared, not bound by romance or convention, had carved something eternal into his heart. In the end, theirs was not the story of a young man and a 67-year-old widow. It was the story of two souls who found each other in a world that often forgets the power of simple kindness. A story that whispered to anyone who heard it, "Love, in all its forms, is what makes us human." Sparkle's word count, 10-130.